It is 1862. A mother stands stiff in a black dress, her face veiled, her body rigid with grief. In her arms she holds her child, silent, pale, gone. A photographer adjusts his tripod. The mother does not blink. The shutter clicks, capturing what seems to be a family portrait. But the truth is far more haunting. The child's eyes have been painted open in the photograph. This isn't horror fiction. This is mourning in the Victorian age. The Victorians lived in a world saturated with death, yet they built rituals that seem both bizarre and sinister to us today. They made jewelry out of human hair. They posed corpses for family portraits. They draped entire houses in black and followed rules of grief so rigid they became prisons. These customs might unsettle us now, but in their time they were a language, a way to cope, to honor, and sometimes to exploit sorrow. From corpse photography to mourning warehouses, from superstitions about mirrors to the chilling fear of premature burial. This is the story of how an entire society mourned the dead. But to understand why Victorians built such haunting rituals, we have to step back. Death was not rare for them, it was everywhere. In 19th century Britain, death was not a rare visitor. It was a constant presence lurking in every street, every home, every family. London, the beating heart of the empire, was also choking on its own filth. Open sewers ran beside homes. Smoke from factories blackened the sky. Epidemics of cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis swept through the city like invisible fires. Children were the most vulnerable. Nearly half of all children born in London died before reaching the age of 5. Families expected loss. A mother might cradle 6 infants in her lifetime, only to see 3 lowered into the ground before they could even walk. Medicine was still primitive. A fever could mean death. A cut could turn septic. Accidents in factories or on crowded streets ended lives in an instant. Funerals were not rare occasions. They were part of the rhythm of life. But the Victorians did not turn away from death. They embraced it, ritualized it, even commercialized it. Mourning was not simply private grief. It was a public duty, a visible performance that showed respect for the dead and the living alike. The sheer scale of death demanded structure. Without it, grief might consume. And so customs were born, elaborate rules that dictated not only how one dressed, but how one lived after loss. It was through this constant confrontation with mortality that the Victorians built a culture of mourning unlike any other, one where grief was worn on the body, displayed in the home, and etched into society's very fabric. And it all began with the clothes. A widow was expected to retreat into deep mourning, wrapped head to toe in dull black crepe. No silk, no shine, no ornament. Her face veiled in black netting, she became a living shadow. This stage could last a full year. Only after that could she move into half mourning, where shades of grey, mauve, or lilac were cautiously permitted. Bright colours were forbidden. Jewellery was restricted to jets or pieces made from the hair of the deceased. The rules were merciless. To grieve too little was scandalous. To grieve incorrectly was shameful. And yet the burden fell hardest on women. Men, if widowed, were rarely held to such lengthy standards. A black armband might suffice. The cost was staggering. Black crepe was expensive, and to maintain the wardrobe over months or years could bankrupt a family. Some women pawned possessions or went hungry to remain respectable. Stories abound of widows trapped in endless cycles of mourning, unable to remarry or rejoin society, their very existence defined by grief. To break the rules was social suicide. One woman, seen wearing lilac too soon, was whispered about as cold and heartless. Mourning became not just personal sorrow, but public theatre. And yet this was only the surface. Clothing concealed something darker. The dead themselves were often woven into the rituals of the living. In an era when photography was still new, death became one of its most frequent subjects. Post-mortem photography, the act of photographing the dead, was a common practice. Families who had never afforded a portrait in life would pay for one in death. For many, it was the only image they would ever have of their loved one. The process was chilling. Corpses were carefully arranged, children propped in chairs, men posed with newspapers, women cradled in beds of flowers. Sometimes the eyes were painted open on the photograph, creating the illusion of life. Other times, stands or wires were used to hold the body upright among the living. The results were unsettling. In some images, It is nearly impossible to tell who is dead and who is alive. Blurred hands or slight movements betray only the living, while the still sharp figure at the center reveals the truth. To the Victorians, these photographs were not macabre. They were treasures, tokens of memory in a world where death could strike at any time. To us, they seem eerie. To them, they were acts of love. But as photography froze grief in images, another practice made mourning even more intimate. Victorians carried their dead not just in portraits, but on their very bodies. Imagine a locket worn close to the heart. Inside, instead of a painted miniature or a photograph, lies a curl of hair. Sometimes it was braided into a bracelet, or woven into intricate designs beneath glass. This was memento mori jewelry. Remember you must die. Victorians crafted rings, brooches, necklaces, and even cufflinks from the hair of the dead. Hair was chosen because it did not decay, a physical remnant that endured long after the body was gone. It was both eerie and comforting, a piece of the loved one always near. Some pieces were simple, others were elaborate, with hair woven into flowers, knots, or landscapes. Inscriptions of names, dates, or phrases like "in memory of" completed the design. This was not hidden but proudly displayed. To wear mourning jewelry was to show devotion, to carry grief openly. Queen Victoria herself popularized the trend, wearing jewelry made from Prince Albert's hair for the rest of her long life. For some, these tokens were sacred. For others, they became fashion. Shops sold ready-made pieces, blending sentiment with commerce. The line between genuine mourning and trend blurred, but hair was not the only commodity in the mourning trade. Entire industries sprang up, ready to profit from grief. Step into London's bustling streets, and you'd find warehouses stacked with black crepe, undertakers competing for business, and catalogues offering ready-made packages of sorrow. Grief in Victorian England was not just a personal burden, it was big business. Every death became an opportunity for profit, and an entire industry grew from the rituals of mourning. The funerals themselves were spectacles. The wealthiest families hired black-plumed horses to pull carriages draped in velvet. Coffins were paraded through the streets, followed by long processions of mourners in matching attire. Professional mutes could even be hired. Men dressed in black who walked silently alongside the cortege, their presence meant to symbolize dignity and sorrow. The more mutes you could afford, the greater your display of respectability. Mourning warehouses thrived in cities like London. These vast shops sold everything a grieving family could need: gowns of crepe, jet jewelry, black gloves, stationery bordered in mourning black. Catalogues offered packages that ranged from modest to extravagant depending on your budget. Death became a marketable event, with retailers ensuring no household faced loss unprepared. The pressure was suffocating. Even poorer families, desperate not to appear careless, went into debt to afford proper funerals. To bury a loved one without ceremony was considered shameful, a sign of disrespect. One account describes a family pawning their bed just to pay for a coffin with a brass nameplate, believing anything less would tarnish their reputation forever. And of course, those who profited most were the undertakers and suppliers. They turned grief into a finely tuned economy, dictating not only what was appropriate, but what was fashionable. A widow might be reminded that her year's mourning dress was out of season, nudged into buying again. Respect for the dead became inseparable from consumer demand. The weight of these expectations fell hardest on women. A man could remarry within months, his mourning brief and practical. A woman, however, might spend years draped in fabrics, bought and replaced at great expense. Mourning was a cage lined with receipts. Behind the velvet and horse plumes, one truth lingered: the spectacle was for the living, not the dead. And as funerals grew larger, rituals stranger, another layer of Victorian mourning emerged, one steeped in superstition. If the mourning dress and funeral processions were about appearances, the superstitions of death were about protection. For Victorians, death wasn't just a moment, it was a passage, and the living had to guard against whatever might linger between the two worlds. The first step came immediately after death. Mirrors were covered with heavy cloth. Some said this was to prevent the soul of the deceased from becoming trapped in the glass. Others feared the reflection might pull the living into death's grasp. Clocks were stopped at the exact moment of passing, freezing time as if to mark the boundary between one life and the next. Windows were opened to allow the soul to escape, drifting upward into the air. But the fears ran deeper. Many believed that death left behind dangerous energy. If a body was carried out feet first, it was said to prevent the spirit from turning back and re-entering the house. Curtains were drawn, fires doused, and animals, particularly cats, kept away lest they disturb the spirit's rest. And then came the wake, nights of vigil where the dead were watched closely before burial. This was partly tradition, but partly fear of premature burial. With medicine still in its infancy, Victorians worried about mistakes. Countless stories circulated of people being declared dead too soon, only to awaken in their coffins. Families sat beside their loved ones, waiting, watching for the faintest stir of breath. Some took even more precautions. Safety coffins were patented, fitted with bells, flags, or tubes that allowed the dead to signal for help if they awoke underground. Graveyards themselves whispered with this unease, rows of stones standing over the possibility of life interrupted. These customs may sound eerie, but to the Victorians they were acts of both love and fear. Love in giving the soul every chance to depart peacefully, fear in making sure it stayed gone. Yet behind every covered mirror and silenced clock, grief still remained. And as we look back, it is clear, Victorian mourning was as much about the living as the dead. The rituals gave order to chaos, but they also weighed heavily, binding families in sorrow long after the funeral ended. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: for Victorians, mourning was never truly over. Even when the black fabric was folded away, the memory of death lingered, in portraits, in jewelry, in the very walls of their homes. And when we look back at Victorian mourning, it's easy to see only the strangeness, the black veils, the hair jewelry, the photographs of the dead propped among the living. But to dismiss it all as bizarre overlooks something deeper. The Victorians lived side by side with death in a way we cannot imagine. Disease, accidents, and poverty claimed lives daily. Death was not hidden in hospitals or sanitized by funeral homes. It came into the home, into the parlor, into the very heart of family life. And when loss is that constant, rituals grow like armor around grief. Every mourning dress, every stopped clock, every plume on a horse-drawn hearse carried meaning. They were attempts to control the uncontrollable, to give shape to despair, to show love, to wrestle with the terror of the unknown. What appears grotesque to us was to them an act of dignity and devotion, and yet there is something undeniably sinister in these customs. The painted eyes on a corpse, the widow imprisoned in crepe, the child watching her mother sink into debt for a coffin she cannot afford. The industry of mourning did not just ease grief, it profited from it. Behind the velvet curtains and black satin gloves was an economy built on sorrow, turning tears into currency. But perhaps the most haunting part is how blurred the line became between the living and the dead. Families clung to hair braided into lockets, to photographs where the deceased sat among the living, to jewelry and rituals that carried the presence of the lost into daily life. Mourning was not a chapter to close, it was a shadow that never left. And so we are left with a chilling question: were the Victorians keeping their dead close to remember them, or to keep them from slipping away entirely? For us today, grief is quieter, often private, tucked away. But in the Victorian era, mourning was a performance, one that exposed love, loss, fear, and obsession all at once. It reminds us that history is not only about empires, inventions, or wars. It is also about how ordinary people faced the most universal of human experiences, death, and in their struggle they left behind customs that still unsettle us, because they hold a mirror to our own fears. We too dread loss. We too long to keep the ones we love close, even when they are gone. So the next time you see a faded Victorian photograph, a locket of hair, or a painting of a family draped in black, remember, these were not curiosities. They were acts of love in a world where death was always at the door, and perhaps, just perhaps, they whisper to us still. If you enjoyed this dive into the eerie world of Victorian mourning, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more hidden stories of history, and share it with someone who thinks the past was all elegance and romance. Because as you've seen beneath the lace and lamplight, history has a much darker side.